Ardal, welcome to Waterstones.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. We're here to talk about Brouhaha, your second novel, but I'd actually, if you don't mind, like to go back to your first novel, The Talk of the Town. A critical and commercial success, but published 25 years ago now.
I know. It's been a long time coming, the second one. I'm not prolific.
And I wondered if you could tell me first where the instinct or sort of the inspiration to write at all first came from.
Well, I've always loved books. I grew up in a household, luckily, that was I was surrounded by books growing up. My mother was an avid reader. I think she probably had a hankering to write herself. So I suppose I was fed books from a very early age. I mean, the Chronicles of Narnia, the children's classics, Robert Louis Stevenson, all of that kind of stuff. And I was always quite attracted to crime fiction as well. So Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, and later Agatha Christie, and then, everything after that. But so I always loved books. Yeah.
So, as I say, Talk of the Town went down really, really well. But I think you've said about how it was tricky to follow that up immediately.
Yeah.
And in fact, the second novel was sort of binned.
Yeah, it was. So The Talk of the Town, I mean, it kind of came out in a splurge. So I always wanted to write a novel. And, I was kind of doing a lot of TV around that time and a lot of live stand-up. So I carved out an amount of time to write that first novel. And I don't really remember writing it. I always feel, again, it sounds very pretentious, but I feel like I was channeling a higher power, if you like. And I remember just like banging away at the typewriter, And so it came out sort of almost fully formed in a way, like for good or for bad, I don't know, but it came out in fully formed, I suppose, in a sense. And luckily it sold very well, and I suppose more importantly, from a first-time writer's point of view, it was reviewed very favorably as well. So that was very gratifying, and so I did want to follow it up, and I kind of made the mistake of accepting an advance from the publisher when I didn't have a good idea.
Yeah,
and I think that's a mistake. I don't know if other writers make it, but I certainly made that mistake. So I spent a lot of time working on a second novel, and I never had the perfect idea, an idea that I was absolutely committed to. So I stopped and started that novel many, many times, and I lost my grip on it, and the tone wavered dramatically from week to week. So it wasn't a very coherent novel. Sentence by sentence, it was fine. I mean, the sentences were well constructed, I believe, but as a novel, it just didn't work. And my publisher absolutely agreed, and so we just quietly binned it. And that was fine, but it was a sobering experience.
Yeah.
And so I suppose I wasn't in a mad hurry to write that elusive second novel until I was sure I had the right story and I had the time and I was committed.
I think you've said about how you've got yourself an office space, you gave yourself some time to sit down and write Brouhaha.
Yeah.
And was that the thing that made the difference in terms of...
I think so, yeah. I mean, I've been looking around for an idea for a long time for a second novel. And I think I was touring my live stand-up show in England back maybe 10 years ago or thereabouts, and I was doing my little bit of research on the town that I was performing in one night, which I do, due diligence and all that. And I stumbled upon this story in a local newspaper. It was a feature-length article about someone who'd gone missing, and it became clear that everyone knew who had done it, but nobody spoke out. And there were a lot of details in that story, like in terms of misdirection and so on, that I found quite compelling. And I thought it would be interesting to transpose a story like that to the border region in Ireland, where I grew up, where, there is a kind of an uneasiness generally. There's a kind of a lawlessness. Now, I don't want to do the region a disservice, but, given the history of that region with the Troubles, and long before that with smuggling over and back across the border, there is that kind of culture of lawlessness or turning a blind eye to the law, at least. And, there is that kind of tension, a slight uneasiness, which I really, really wanted to capture. So I had the kind of nugget of an idea for the story, and I had the tone and the sense of place. It's funny, as a writer or even as a comedian, you do go back to your hometown, to your formative years, for a lot of inspiration. It's quite interesting. I actually read Colin Tobin recently. He wrote a foreword for think it was a Graham Greene novel, and he remarked on that and how, you know, even in Graham Greene novels, like he keeps harking back to aspects of his childhood and a place that he was very familiar with. And so that was true in my case. And I really wanted to capture that tone that I grew up with, because I think the humour is very, very black, and the demeanour of the people is very deadpan, and the way with words is very special. So I wanted to capture all that in the context of a well, you know, it's a bog standard philosophical novel, like all novels are. But I wanted to sort of cloak it in, you know, as a not disguise it as a crime novel, but certainly use some of the tropes of crime fiction, which I had always had a love for. You know, so in terms of maybe the language is kind of more hard-boiled than it might be normally. It's a kind of a heightened realism, if you like. You know, events are maybe telescoped into a shorter time frame than they would be. Because, you know, like, I read a lot of novels, and, you know, sometimes the story kind of really meanders or whatever, and that's fine. I mean, you know, I think mine does as well. So it's not an out-and-out potboiler by any means. You know, because I think the novel, like, you know, it is a broad canvas, and you know, you do give yourself the scope to kind of develop ideas and to digress. I mean, digression is a big part of my characters, you know, and a big part of me. It's a big part of everyone. You know, we digress, we get sidetracked, we lose our train of thought, but then we get back on track again.
There is, of course, huge humour in this book, and there seems to be a lot of Irish art which has this combination of politics, violence, and comedy, which is an extraordinary combination to have, and it seems to, but it is very particular to Ireland. Where does that black humour come from?
Well, you know, I think it's there. You know, the comedy and the dark humour is there throughout Irish literature, and it possibly goes back to, you know, hundreds of years of kind of oppression. Like, for example, like, you know, the Irish people, I suppose, were disenfranchised for a very, very long time. You know, they probably didn't have recourse to the law, for example. You know, they were probably hamstrung in terms of, you know, the kind of jobs they were able to do and so on. And so all you really do have is your language, and you have your imagination. I mean, that's really all you have to turn to. And I think you see this in Irish literature time and time again, you know, kind of a healthy disrespect for authority, for the law, you know, and a kind of a violence. My violence is quite stylized, I think. You know, but you do see it, like, so you know, dark humor is very important. I suppose it's a way of processing, isn't it? And I think it's telling that, you know, there's a lot of writers in the North now who are writing brilliantly. And I've just been reading David Keenan, who's not actually Northern Irish, I don't think, but he's Scottish, but, you know, writing hilariously funny, violent, profane stuff about the Troubles.
Ardal, there is, as I said, so much in here that we could talk about, but thank you so much for giving us some time today.
Thank you very much indeed, Will. Cheers.